pleasure and my thanks to Andreas, I can't see him, and Robert for inviting me here to speak on a topic which I think is emerging as one of the most important paradigm shifts in international relations. And that is to talk about the new major powers of Asia. And so I pose a question to myself when I look at the discourses both within China and India. So the main question that came to my mind is that do you really have a common Asian understanding of what the future of international relations should be? And what are the major issues that come up? So I'm going to concentrate on two countries, China and India. So my main point is that it's already established that the shift from the west to the east is underway. This has been established, it was predicted by the National Intelligence Council, and it seems to be undergoing. And when I say new major powers, what I mean is that in terms of economy and in terms of military, it's a very clear shift. Already China and India are the second and the third largest economies in the world. And in military expenditure terms, again, China and India have emerged as some of the world's largest importer of energy. Now, what do I say here? So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to focus on the internal strategic logic of China and India and try to argue a case of what is it that they both prefer in terms of the Asian geopolitics. Now, one of the questions also that came to my mind is that there's a lot of discussion in international relations that China would implode, that the economy would go down, there will be a bubble. But from the point of view of today, I don't want to address that because it is a given that China has risen. And so questions whether it will implode in the future is not what I'm going to talk about today. What I'm going to talk about today is where is China going today? And what are the strategic preferences that China actually looks forward in Asia? There are three issues that I'll bring to the table. One is, of course, its first strategic choice. And these are the choices that China seems to be making and also seem to be preferring in terms of priority. China could also be prioritizing its engagement in far Africa or Latin America. That's there, but that's not its first priority choice from my point of view. It's basically its presence in East Asia. And it does want to do it because of the historical dimension of what China's engagement was with East Asia. In my conversations with Chinese strategic thinkers, both from the Academy of Social Sciences, the Chinese Institute of International Studies, when they come to India, their main projection is that China wants to have an additional influence in East Asia, which was historically its realm of domain. And the second thing is that it is still a bit wary of the US presence. And I'll get to that and answer why. Now, what is also fascinating to me to look at the discourse is that China has actually recognized the very pivotal role the Americans play in getting China to the high table. So if you remember, just after the Second World War, it was Roosevelt who actually encouraged China to be a part of the high table in the formation of the United Nations. And China is grateful for that. If you look at the discourses, it comes out. So that is a very important fact, which I don't see so much discussed when we talk about China and its engagement with the Americans. But what is fascinating is that China, despite that gratitude, there is a very important dimension, and that is when China sees US presence in East Asia. The American argument, which I have been listening to, is that the Americans view their presence in East Asia as a reassuring point in terms of keeping the balance, in terms of keeping the peace, and especially their alliances with South Korea and Japan. But then, what is fascinating is that China, despite that gratitude, please keep that in mind, does not view that as reassuring. And for a simple reason, because from the Chinese perspective, the American presence in East Asia is about looking at China as an adversary. So the main question they ask is, why is it that Americans need to have so much presence at all in East Asia if China was the reassuring factor? The fact is that China is not reassuring, and so that is from their perspective. And so what has China done in the last few years to kind of question that? The one way China has tried to question that is to reset the calculation of risk, to kind of question the credibility of America's reassurance with allies. And one recent example was, of course, the air defense identification zone, which China came up with. And also, of course, there's the questioning of the disputed territories, but more important is this. So when China came up with this, one thing which I saw in debates in the Pentagon is that how do you reassure our allies you cannot have a strong military counter. So how do you do it? Of course, you have the B-52 bombers flying over the disputed area. But the worrisome part from an Indian perspective was, in case China had escalated it back, had actually questioned the American B-52 bombers coming over an area that they have recognized as their air defense identification zone, what would have happened to Asia? And that is where your question about 1914 being repeated. There are these slight single provocations that would lead to escalation. And I don't want to exaggerate it, but if you remember, there was a very important piece that came out in the People's Daily by a PLA general, who later, of course, de-escalated his point. He said that if Americans respond, we would respond back. And this was actually debated a lot in India too, about what could be the possible scenario. So there are these meeting points in East Asia where China is actually trying to reassert itself. Now, the most important fact also is about the Asian pivot here. Now, when the Asian pivot was announced, with Hillary Clinton coming to Asia and saying that China has to go by the code of conduct in the South China Seas, secondly, the Americans support a cooperative stand, and that we will rebalance. And the most critical identification of the rebalance strategy from the American point of view was the 2012 US DoD document, which stated very clearly that American forces are going to rebalance. And what was interesting for me, because I was there in the US, was that they identified India too as a strategic partner in the Asian rebalance. And I'll get to that in my India part. Now, how did China see this? It's been mentioned by my former colleague that China saw it basically not as a reassurance mechanism in keeping the peace in Asia, but also in terms of a kind of balancing of China, if not containing fully. A balancing of the Chinese rise, fencing it, and so this was how they interpreted it. And there was a bit of concern about this rebalance. But the other issue which came up in terms of the rebalance is whether Americans would actually be able to maintain their military presence in East Asia. And that is where I'll get to later in my next section. How do the Chinese, so within China too, so this is what I want to bring to the table, is that when you look at discourses within China itself, again, there is no single voice. There are different voices that come out. So this is one perspective, looking at the Asian pivot, looking at the South China Sea crisis as confrontation, as escalation. But then if you look at discourses, again, coming out from the same academy, from Kikir, which are important in the foreign policy think tanks, they argue that America and China has a lot of strategic dialogues too. And so I'll mention in terms of facts how much the dialogues are. And they also refer to the visit by President Xi Jinping to the US in February, where he met President Obama, and where they very clearly mentioned that they would prioritize mutual common referral points. So they make a mention of that. Now, what is the discourse that is coming out from the American perspective too, to this Chinese prioritization of its presence in East Asia? Now, one of the important voices is, of course, John Mearsheimer, who's an offensive realist, who looks at China's rise as a problem in international relations, looking at it as a counter to the US. He argued that what is very, very important is that the US-China tension is actually an existential threat to the peace in East Asia. And what is also important is that China is seeing its role, not just as countering the US, but also about prestige and about its identity historically in East Asia. And it's also that which influences China's desire to have more presence in this particular region. Now, in terms of flashpoint, now this is where, again, I think why East Asia as a problem area is important is because you also have the presence of nuclear weapons. So it's not like 1914, where you probably did not have the presence of the nukes. Now you, of course, have the presence of the nukes. I would like to believe in John Gaddis's argument of the long peace, where nuclear weapons actually de-escalate conflict at a higher level, and so you have very limited conflict. But then this calculation comes in. Now the flashpoint, unlike 1914, would of course be here. And what would be the main flashpoints? The main flashpoints would be the Korean Peninsula, the Taiwan Straits, South and East China Sea. And Mearsheimer believes that if a conflict breaks out between China and the US, China and Japan in particular, the US can either act as a referee or enter the conflict on the side of Japan. I'm a bit skeptical about the US entering as a referee because if you look at China's strategic priority too, one of the concerns, as I mentioned in the beginning, was the US presence itself. So for the US to enter as a referee is probably not going to happen in the way he thinks it. But of course, he also ends with the option that the US would actually side with Japan. And it's important to keep that in mind. Now, in terms of, again, coming back to the Chinese perspective, what is important is that if you look at the recent contemporary debates in China itself, again on this crisis and on the East Asia issue, one of the main debates, again for the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, is that China-Japan relations, especially in the present context, is going to escalate because there is an increase in hawkish tensions in Japan, and because of the election of Shinzo Abe, who is supposedly hawkish in terms of China-Japan relation. And so they see that Japan might actually see Abe's coming to power as an opportunity to nationalize the disputed Shankaku Island, Ryu Island dispute by taking advantage of the US pivot to Asia policy. So you can see that the US pivot to Asia policy is seen by China as in Japan's interest, and which is very interesting because that would actually lead to a kind of escalatory mode from the Chinese side. Now, let me also elaborate here why I made the point that, and I'll get back to the 1914 debate here a bit, because from my perspective, even if I say that this is a problem area, I would argue that the 1914 scenario, while very, very interesting for us to keep in mind in terms of a cautionary tale, is probably not going to happen for a simple reason that unlike 1914, where you had not so much of dialogical mechanisms within the countries that actually fought the war, in terms of China-US, if you look at the amount of engagement that is happening today, there are 1,000 officials meeting every year in the strategic and economic dialogue mechanism. There is much more in terms of business activity. And if you look at China's own strategic prioritization, what is China looking at in terms of dispute? I don't think it's looking at creating escalatory logic with regard to the dispute because it wants to have a conflict. It's doing it because it wants to sensitize not just countries within East Asia, but also outside about its own historical claims. You might dispute those claims, but that's the Chinese perspective. And it's important to understand that, because it's very easy to demonize them, but it's important to know why they're making these claims. And so it's fascinating to see that. The other important thing is that China itself is making so much of effort in dealing with this issue through regional mechanisms. It's an important part of ASEAN +3, where they actually have talked about the South China Sea dispute. Secondly, it's also a part of SCO, where Russia is a very important player. It's recently signed bilateral agreements with India for resolving border dispute peacefully. So it's itself making a lot of efforts in terms of de-escalating the conflict. And that's an important perspective to keep in mind. Now, in terms of my second strategic priority for China, the second strategic priority and choice for China is to become a power of reckoning in Asia. And I think there are three ways China wants to do this. One, by having its own additional discourse, not just from a strategic point of view, but also from a very conceptual point of view. So you have concepts like the new model of great powers, which I'm sure my colleague will talk about and what that means. The second important thing in terms of its own power of reckoning, and this is institutionally what China is doing. So recently, if you know, in 2013, China actually established a $50 billion Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank. Now, what this bank would do is to offer loans to build infrastructure for countries in Asia which do not have good road networks. And one of the interesting things, which from an Indian perspective, where actually China is seen in terms of more a threat perception, is to actually attract that investment into India itself. If you see the statements of the recent Indian Prime Minister, he wants to have China doing investment within India. And so the other countries too. And that is an important way of making its presence felt. And I'll say why that's important, because it also adds to the legitimization process, which China is trying to encourage and establish, not just additionally, but also through monetary power. And it's very, very notable because the countries within Asia are seeing that and acknowledging that particular fact. Now, in terms of showcasing power and reach outside of Asia, just a bit why, if you see the debates, even just from within India, the Indian discourse studies a lot about the historical hold of China, the very old connections, religious, civilizational, Buddhism. So all those facts matter. And not just that, it also tries to understand how China had seen itself from an empire which had, of course, tributary relationship, but how it saw itself in terms of its spread across Asia. And it's actually coming over the contemporary discourse, even within India, of trying to understand China. Now, of course, this is how China looked in terms of tributary missions, which also, and so I'll end by saying that there is a difference between the tributary system historically and what China is trying to do now. So no, you cannot say that China's engagement in Africa are based on some kind of tributary system, which I've seen some of the articles make comments to. But this was how China had actually got tributes. And this is data from the 14th or the 15th century, I think 15th century. So it's fascinating to know that. Now, this is a bit of a graphical display of the tributary system. So now in terms of the third choice, the first choice was China's presence in East Asia, where it actually is pushing muscle power and additional influence, building relationships with not just the Americans, but also Japan and South Korea, and also trying to build relationship with India, getting India's understanding on it. The second is becoming a power of reckoning in Asia. And by power, I mean not just soft power, in terms of also hardcore power, economic largeness, which China is showing towards countries in Asia. Now, in terms of broadcasting its power outside of Asia. Now, I think when I look at the Chinese discourses, one thing that China is very much trying to broadcast is it wants to showcase itself as a responsible stakeholder in this system. And this is fascinating because it also does action which wants to question the system. So you see two different, very interesting trends coming out from China's engagement outside of just East Asia and Asia. Now, the other way that China is trying to improve its presence is, of course, through the mechanism of the BRICS. We have the BRICS summit happening just today and tomorrow in Brazil, where the head of states are meeting. They're coming up with their own bank, as I was mentioning. Now, this bank, I don't know how this discourse was actually reflected in your own presses, in the UK or in the US, but in India, it was a huge discourse. The BRICS Bank, it was seen as an alternate. So it's fascinating for me because if you look at it from a perceptional point of view, let's forget the hard facts. From a perceptional point of view, the IMF and the World Bank are seen as being pro-West. And it's interesting because perceptions matter in international relations and also in domestic politics. Whereas the BRICS Bank is going to be seen as very pro-Eastern countries or not pro-West. And it's interesting. The other thing is that who will be the head of the BRICS Bank? That is also debated a lot. And so this is how even China is trying to make a dent just outside of Asia too. So going to Latin America, to Africa. Now, one of the ways which I think why I say there is a difference between China's conception of tribute. I mean, my Chinese colleague I would love to know from you more about that historical concept. But just from my own understanding, if you look at the tributary system, it was also based on coercion to some extent. But if you look at China's engagement, for instance, with Africa, and I was looking at the data for Africa, and so if you look at the investment there, it's a huge, huge amount of investment. And what is interesting is that the investment is not just for mining, not just for getting out oil, it's also on human factors, health, education. So I can give you the data sheet, I'm sure you all know it, China's investing hugely on that. So from that, what I imbibed was that China wants to show that the power that it is broadcasting also has some kind of legitimacy. So it's very much interested in questions of legitimacy, how its power is actually viewed by countries outside of Asia. And it's actually making a huge effort in this regard. And it's interesting to see when you see the kind of investment that goes into that. Now the final question, and then I'll get to India, is that besides all this, so what are the contradictory trends that come out? And this is interesting. So one trend is about a legitimization of power, showcasing its own power, becoming more important in terms of a responsible stakeholder. But the contradictory trend is that China is also doing things which creates a kind of fear psychosis in its neighbors and also outside of Asia to an extent. And what is that? And that is in terms of, first of all, aggressively staking its claims on territory, not just in East Asia or Southeast Asia, South China Sea or East China Sea, but also in terms of India. There are border disputes with India, and also China claims one of the states of India, as you know. They view it as southern Tibet and Arunachal Pradesh. I'll talk about that a bit later. But what is interesting is that if you look at the interpretations of how China actually views strategy. So one of the, I'm not a China specialist, but I tried to understand how it has been interpreted. So one of the ways that one of the most famous scholars on China, Ian Johnston, has looked at, I'm sure all of you have heard about him, he had actually looked into he did a detailed assessment of the 7 military classics of ancient China. And what he concluded, I mean, I've got the references here. What he concluded was that there was a Confucian Mantian-dominated set of assumptions which views diplomacy and economic incentives as merely symbolic gestures, but the best way to deal with a threat to China was with a use of force and strategy. So this is what he concluded from his assessment. Now, according to Johnston, the Chinese classics stress on the role of violence-based solutions to conflicts. Non-violent means were only seen as expedient, especially when one was facing a powerful adversary, and hence negotiation and diplomacy were seen as delaying tactics. Hence, for China to argue that it has a pacifist culture and history is not supported by its past writings and strategic thinking. So this was one of the conclusions which he came to, and it's interesting to know that there is this view too. But then I was also reading Sun Tzu's Art of War. So Sun Tzu was also mentioned that it's important not to actually have violent conflicts when you can get your incentives or your goals met without the use of violence. So there is this very fascinating discourse within China. I mean, let's face it, all countries actually have discourses on the use of violence. India has it. We have Kautilya, the famous Arthasastra, which talks about the use of violence in international relations. Also, we have Gandhi, who talked about non-violence. So it's not just China who has this different discourses on the use of violence and non-violence. Even a country usually seen as very pacifist, like India, had it. So it's nothing surprising, but I'm just trying to bring it to the fore so that we understand the kind of perspective that how China is viewed. Now, let's get to India. What is India's strategic pillar, and what are its power projection mechanisms? Now, there are three again. So the first is, of course, and I'm talking about contemporary. I mean, historically, as you know, India has always been has been a non-aligned country. Doesn't want to align with anyone. But that does not mean non-alignment with nobody. Did not want to align with the US or the USSR. But it had actually alignments with all the non-aligned countries. So the non-aligned countries were Africa, countries in Asia. So there are alliances there, but it was seen as the non-alignment to the superstructure of international relations. But that has changed. India is no more so much wary about alignments. And one of the most important things that is coming out in terms of India's power projection capability. Now, before I get to more this particular issue, I would like to say that if you look at the perspectives of India itself, I don't think anybody in India would believe if somebody tells Indians that you are the emerging great power. India would see itself as a major power. It's a power that has now system-shaping capabilities and roles and has resources to bring to the table. But in terms of great power, in terms of ability to project your power far beyond your shores geographically, I don't think any Indian strategist would actually believe that particular notion. So it's important to keep that particular caution in mind. But what is fascinating is that in terms of bilateral relationship, one of the important pillars which has come out post-Cold War is the US-India relationship. And before, as you know, the US-India relationship had always been very difficult. The first Prime Minister, Nehru, was not comfortable with the American alliance. He was ideologically very much socialist and uncomfortable with American capitalism, but just not just it. He was also uncomfortable with alignments with great powers, and that was the main reason. But things changed since the 1990s, and India is becoming closer to the US. And how has it got closer? So I'm just trying to give you a few pictures of the kind of bohemy that exists. So the president who is supposedly responsible for better relationship is, of course, Bill Clinton, who you see is very happy being in India. And this was in 2000, and that was the start of the closeness of the relationship. And I've not spoken about Pakistan at all, and I will. I usually feel that Pakistan always comes in when we talk about India, but this is important. Now, Bush, of course, was the man who institutionalized that particular relation. For India, having an international status as a nuclear weapons state was extremely important. But India is not a signatory to the NPT, as you know. It tested nuclear weapons in 1998, tested nuclear technology in 1974, and in 2005 it signed a deal with the US, the Indo-US nuclear deal, which actually, de facto recognized it as a nuclear weapon power. India is now a member of the NSG, the Nuclear Suppliers Group. And so it's interesting how the trend has shifted. But what is very, very interesting is that if you look at it from the US perspective, how is it viewing India? So I looked at the documents and the statements from the Pentagon, the State Department, and the US White House the press releases. One of the things which caught my eye was that India has been recognized in most of the document as the key strategic security provider in the Indian Ocean region, of course, because of naval capability, and also in terms of the Asian pivot. So it's recognized as one of the key strategic partners, and one of the main thing which the U.S. Defense Secretary Leon Panetta, when he was in India, stated that the Americans would help India in terms of building capability to become the regional security provider in this particular region. But what has it done to India's relationship with China? It has had an impact, and which is also an important strategic insight to give. Now, when China viewed the growing India-US relationship, it saw it not as, again, as you see in East Asia. It did not see the US-India growing together as something that is about regional security providing or reassuring or peacekeeping. It was about containing China. So if you look at the Chinese perspective, they saw India getting closer, Americans trying to court India as looking at it within the containment of China. And where do I get this insight? If you look at the arguments in Global Times, People's Daily, scholars, we have a lot of bilateral with Chinese think tanks, Kikir. Most of them are very concerned about this growing together. And they keep asking us, what is the reason why you have come together? And what is fascinating is that these questions are not just asked to us. When I was in the US Institute of Peace last year, we had a lot of delegations from China who asked us the same question. What are the reasons why this kind of military defense cooperation is happening between India and the United States? And what is worrisome for India is that the same year in 2005, and 2006, the Chinese premier visited India. And right after that, China, who was not very aggressive about its claims on India or claims on Indian territory, started officially getting very aggressive about their claims. And this was one thing which was seen with concern. And so, if you see the 2006 statement by the Chinese ambassador to India, who said that the whole of Arunachal belongs to India, China, they had never made that kind of official statement. They were always about conciliation. And so most of Indian strategists saw this as a counterbalance to the US-India relationship, and which the connection was made. And so the date, the timing, and the connection was very much made within India, and which was interesting for me to see as an observer. And so this is what when I say about the impact on India. Now, in terms of what is India's response, so this is the state, of course, which I'm talking about. So China claims its whole state, which is 90,000 square kilometers of territory in square miles. I don't know how much square kilometers would be. So, and Tawang is where you have the most important second Tibetan monastery, and you would know that. So it's very directly connected to Tibet. And recently I went to a conference from the Tibetan perspective. So there is a history behind this particular claim, which was actually administered and had relationships with Tibet. But then, of course, that's a different, I don't want to bring that here. Now, in terms of China's, what is it that India is concerned about in terms of the rise of China and the impact on India's own dispute with China? So one thing which is happening in the last few years where India is concerned about, and of course India is also responding to it. I'm not saying that India is not adding to the sphere of dialogue, it is. And so there is the militarization in Tibet, if you see. So here is my, I hope you can see it, it's here. And then India is also doing it. India is having also a lot of military presence and also has actually deployed one of its nuclear-tipped missile, the BrahMos, to this particular area. So there is an escalation at the border, right after, say, 2005, 2006. And this was not the case before that, because of, in terms of China's rise, the stated demand on Indian territory and the kind of response that it's having. Now, of course, this is a bit of data. These are the border intrusions, and in terms of the rapid reaction forces that China has. Now, in terms of, and so this is also important, is that the concept of, so what is also another concern of India in terms of China's rise, is this whole developments in Burma and in Myanmar. So even in Burma and Myanmar, there's a huge Chinese investment development. So the concern from India is that it's very close to one of its strategic areas, the northeast of India. And so there is this concern about the rise of China. So what are China's intentions really? Why is it increasing its presence around India and building ports, having connections with the ethnic communities in Myanmar? As you know, Myanmar has one of the largest armed groups, the United Wa State Army, which is very deeply connected to China in some sense, if not overtly supported. So these are the concerns from the Indian side. Now let me end with how is this whole development looked at? Is there one voice or are there different voices? And then I'll give my final views on whether the scenarios that I've created would actually lead to a 1914 kind of scenario. And I'll say where it might lead to and why I at least would end that I don't think it would. And that's not based on hope, but what I see in terms of the strategic cultures within India and China. Now in terms of the strategic culture, the third pillar, which influences India's policy and its aspiration for becoming a major power, is that there are three views. One is of course the Nehruvian view, which I talked about, which does not believe in violence, which wants to cooperate with China, which wants to have better relationship with other major powers of the world, believes in international institutions, do not believe in defense spending, and is more pacifist to some extent. It is a very important stream in Indian foreign policy even today, but it's not the dominant stream. It was dominant in the 1950s and the 1960s, till the 1970s, but now it's more the second, realism. So when I say realism, what do I mean? So there are realists who have more interest in defense spending in India, and which is on the rise. So if you see the Indian foreign policy discourse now, there are three issues that concerns India. One is of course intentions from its neighbors, the importance of nuclear weapons as India's defense and deterrence strategy, and the other thing is a huge pressure on the government to increase spending on defense. So there is the desire for acquisition of more weapons system, more defense mechanisms at the border, so a great belief in military expansion power and influence in broadcasting it. And the other thing is that improve modernization of the Indian Navy. So this particular stream is getting an upper hand now. But then there's also the neoliberal stream, which believes in economic cooperation, improving India's power as an economic power in the world, and also believe in cooperation with China and wanting to attract investments in India. But what I would like to end with is that in terms of just strategic cultures, the second one is in the ascendancy as of today, because of the scenario that I created in terms of China, in terms of what China's role is in the world, and what are its intentions. But there are the other limiting influences. Now, will all this lead to a 1914 kind of scenario? If you listen to me, you would think yes. But then I would argue that both India and China, if you look at their larger pillar within which they are having this kind of tense discourses, or even in terms of East Asia. Okay, the other thing I forgot to mention is that in terms of China's response to its increased aggression in South China Sea or the East China Sea, one thing which India has done in the last few years, which I think, and I'll end there, is that India has also increased its cooperation with Japan. For instance, there are recent agreements with Japan in terms of a defense agreement in 2012. For the first time, India and Japan have naval exercises. They'll have officers posted in each other's military, which had not happened before. This is very new trends in India-Japan relationship too. And the other important thing is, it also has a new defense agreement with South Korea, where the Indian defense minister for the first time visited South Korea with Vietnam. You'll be surprised, all these trends are very new. This kind of very strong defense mechanisms with Australia, Japan, South Korea, and Vietnam. So there's a response, and the main response, so when I asked one of the policymakers in India who's behind this kind of, I asked, what is your main reason for this? So his answer was, of course, it's about maintaining the sea lanes of communication, the freedom of the seas. And that's why we want to have more and more naval cooperation. and become the net provider of security. So that was the reason given for it. And I would maybe have a discussion on that. But in the end, I would say that, okay, I mean, despite the fact that there are these tensions, finally, what is important is that if you think of whether the scenario that existed in whether we will have, there are indications it could happen. Because first of all, there are disputes, and there is militarization at the border, especially India-China. There is a lot of discourse within Japan and South Korea and China too, which is uncomfortable with their own disputes. They have their history. India has a history with China. India hasn't forgotten the 1962 defeat by China. The Indian military, if you talk to them, they still remember the defeat. They having to actually run away from the battlefield. And so these are very important mechanisms which are still there. But despite that, both countries have also collaborated. They have collaborated on issues of climate change. They have collaborated in terms of making new institutions. As I said, the BRICS. They have collaborated in ASEAN. There is a desire for India to have a greater role by China in South Asia, supported the observer status. Everybody says Pakistan got China in, but without India's support, it would have been not easy for China to get in. So there is this kind of support. And I think if you look at the discourses so there are different 3 levels, and so that is why I think the 1914 scenario will probably not repeat. It's my hope, and I also see there are these mechanisms. And that is, if you look at India itself, I don't know about China, there are 3 different thoughts that think about whether this scenario can actually happen. One is, of course, the strategist, the grand strategies, the strategist who thinks about use of force and how that can be expanded. They are really concerned that China's aggression or India's response to it, the security dilemma that exists in East Asia, the lack of clarity, might lead to a conflict. But then they also argue that because of the presence of nuclear weapons, it will not escalate, like it escalated in 1914. And so nuclear weapons are a great deterrence weapon. They are a bluff strategy, you will not use it, but it actually de-escalates the conflict. The second, of course, is the point of view of the Nehruvians who want to cooperate with China, who wants to have more and more institutional mechanisms with China, wants to have, in fact, a collaborative understanding even on maintaining the freedom of the seas. And the final is, of course, the policy makers. And so Nehruvians are also academics and think tankers and researchers like me. But the final is the policy maker. So in terms of policy making in India, right from the prime minister to the finance minister to the defense minister, and sometimes even the army chiefs and the navy and the air chiefs. When I talk to them personally, especially military, they would argue that it is not in India's interest to escalate any kind of conflict with China, and that is very clear. So they would say that it's better researchers like you work for cooperation. We do not want a war situation happening in Asia for one simple reason, and that is that India and China have benefited from the international system. And because China and India have benefited from the international system, it is not in India and China's interest. It's not a moral argument. It's more an interest, strategic argument. And it's interesting to keep that in mind. But the concern they have is if the international system exists as it exists today, with very limited representation, for instance, in the UNSC. China, of course, is a member. And in terms of the kind of structures that exist, which is very much pro-American or pro-West, this is a perception. So if that doesn't change, there could be revisionist tendencies. India has been revisionist. It has been a non-member. It has actually gone against the NPT, has the non-alignment movement. But it sees China also getting revisionist if that doesn't happen. So in my conclusion, I would say that there is skepticism that 1914 would repeat, which is good for us. But then there is that little concern that because of these tensions and disputes, there could be limited levels of conflict. So I'll end there. Thank you.